What's up, everybody?
You might remember this particular scene from a previous video that I uploaded to my channel, where my Ducati Desert Sled got to take a nap on its right side, and in doing so, it rested all 450 plus pounds of its massive Italian weight on that rear brake lever and right foot peg. Now, the brake lever itself held up, didn't bend or anything, but it exposed a pretty serious design flaw regarding that rear brake sensor switch that happens to double as the only resting point or return stop for the rear brake lever. In this video, I'm going to completely remove that cruddy plastic OEM sensor and replace it with an aftermarket hydraulic brake switch sensor. If you have a Scrambler Desert Sled and you ever intend to ride off-road, or even if you just plan to drop the bike on the right side, you might find this instructional video quite helpful. Don't think that's supposed to happen. So you're going to start by removing the passenger foot pegs from the bike. Those bolts take a 6mm Allen key. Now, don't go anywhere with those bolts. You're going to want to put them right back where they go to hold that brake master cylinder in place so it doesn't move around on you during the work. Make sure you have a shop rag handy because you're going to be dealing with brake fluid, and that stuff is very corrosive and you don't want it messing up the finish on your bike. Now it's on to the scary stuff. Go ahead and remove that bolt and both washers from the end of the rear brake cylinder and throw those away. Their services are no longer needed. Now there's the star of the show, that new hydraulic brake switch. It comes with 2 new washers, so put one on the new brake switch bolt there and the other one underneath the brake line as you plop it into place. Now at this point you can tighten it down all the way, but be careful to keep the wires from getting jammed up on those other lines there. Next, it's time to move on to the wiring. So you're going to take a 4mm Allen and remove those bolts that are holding the side cover in place. Up at the top there's supposed to be a third bolt where my hands end up going, but I stripped those threads the very first time I took off the side cover. Now, once you get that removed, I like to put those bolts back in the hanger brackets so you don't lose them. I took a pair of snips to cut some zip ties holding the pieces in place and started working to remove the wiring harness for that OEM brake switch sensor. It's just a nice little clip there that you can see pretty easily. A couple of zip ties.
And pull that wiring harness up and out of the frame.
Here is that design flaw I mentioned. Do you notice those skinny push tabs that are very obviously broken? Those are supposed to hold this sensor in place while the brake lever rests on the switch. Now at this point, I routed the wiring for the new brake switch up through the frame. This took a little bit of dexterity, but it does end up fitting through the tab on the back side of the frame there. I wanted to use that same clip from the original brake sensor's wiring harness, so you can see I'm mocking up how much slack or overlap I'm going to need. That was until I saw you can just shove any excess wiring in the space under the battery tray, so I ended up just cutting a few extra inches just to be safe. Now in this wiring you just cut, you're going to have 3 wires exposed. You're going to take the blue one, fold it out of the way. We're going to come back to that one later. That leaves you with the gray and brown wires, which you're going to end up adding butt connectors to each of those, which will connect to the wiring harness that comes with the new hydraulic brake sensor. Normally when I do automotive wiring, I don't end up using connectors like this, but I did it this way just because the new brake sensor wiring already had those butt connectors wired in, so I figured go ahead and do it this way. You'll see here in a second I made a bit of a mistake. I don't normally use these connectors, and so I didn't realize that using the heat gun would actually shrink the tips of those openings, which made them unusable. So you see here I have to cut them off and do it again. That was an easy mistake to remedy though. I just did it all again, and this time when I was using the heat gun I was very careful not to heat up the ends of those butt connectors, and they work just fine. So now we're back to that blue wire. The blue wire doesn't do anything as far as I can tell. If anybody knows what this blue wire goes to or what the purpose is, feel free to comment below and let me know. But I ended up just folding it back on itself, putting some heat shrink over it, and getting it out of the way. Once that's all done, you can see I put another piece of heat shrink over the whole thing, clean it up a little bit. I connect it with the wiring on the new brake sensor wiring and clipped it into place in the bike, shoved it there underneath the battery tray, and all of a sudden you now have a fully functioning hydraulic rear brake switch. And you got just a couple of housekeeping items before you put everything back together. Take some zip ties, tie the wiring harnesses back to the frame, and put everything back basically exactly where it came from. Now that everything is wired up and put back where it goes, it's time to test your work. So you can see me pressing on the brake lever a couple of times, making sure that the brake light actually lights up, and it does. So that means we get to move on to bleeding the brakes, because when you open up the line, you probably got some air in it. I took some tubing there and made it fit over the nipple. You get a 11 millimeter wrench to actually open up the brake nut, and you can see my Gatorade bottle for the catch can. I'm using DOT4 brake fluid. So opening up the reservoir there, and again, remember what I said about brake fluid being very corrosive, so take that shop rag and put it on your swing arm, because you can see I spilled right there. I ended up spilling a few more times. I made a huge mess. I'm not good at this part, but this is all just pretty standard brake bleed procedure. You keep filling the reservoir, you open up the brake line to drain the bubbles out into the Gatorade bottle while you pump the brakes with it closed. Keep the brakes pumped while you open up the line, and then close it before you release the brake. A bunch of Google searches will tell you how to bleed brakes, but there you have it.
All right, so we are almost done now. The old rear brake switch is no longer needed to turn the brake light on, but it served a second very important job as well, which was to act as the stop or the return for the brake pedal. And so what I did was I went into my spare parts bin, I found a bolt and a nut that were about the dimensions that I needed. Now it's a pretty tight fit behind that bracket that this bolt is going to mount on. So here's a trick I can show you. I take this double-sided sticky tape and put it on my wrench, and then put the nut inside of it to hold it in place. Get a little bit of Loctite, dab it in the hole of the nut, and then here I'm putting the new brake stop in the hole, lining up the nut and the wrench on the backside, and you can see that when I remove it, the nut is gone. So I could have been done at this point. However, I really haven't liked how much free play the rear brake pedal has had before the actual brakes engage. And so I figured while I'm here, might as well go ahead and adjust that free play to reduce the amount of free play there is, not completely eliminate it. You always want to make sure that you have a little bit of free play still, so that way you don't leave your rear brakes always slightly engaged. You don't want to wear those pads out too fast. You can see this is pretty easy. You just loosen that lock nut, and then you twist the rod counterclockwise or clockwise to either engage it more or engage it less until you get the amount of free play to your liking. You know, as you can see, I can barely move it now at this point without it or before it engages, but there's still a little bit of that free play, so it's not engaging right away, and that's where I wanted it. So once you have it in place, you tighten everything back in. All is good. All right, so I've adjusted the free play in the brake pedal. So I stop a little bit in case, you know, it swells or whatever. And then you see, let's see if the light catches it. Basically, I have this nut, bolt and nut thing that I went just through that original bracket, and this stopper goes and hits it kind of right square in the middle. Put some Loctite on there on the back, so that's great. And man, there she is. Just double check with the key. See if I can reach. Huzzah. Sweet.